right on cue to prove that absolute power corrupts absolutely, the New South Wales government has decided that Daniel Andrews is an appropriate role model when it comes to effectively shelving the role of the Parliament in exchange for executive orders. Health Minister Brad Hazzard has decided to extend the state's COVID-19 emergency powers until March 2023. And keep in mind here that a state of emergency doesn't even have to be in force in order for the government, or more specifically Health Minister Brad Hazzard, to declare any measure he deems necessary to protect the public health during a pandemic. And as the crossbenchers in the Victorian Upper House debate their 7 pointless little amendments that genius politician Daniel Andrews used to get them on board after his ambit claim of permanent and unlimited powers, the New South Wales Cabinet has decided that it needs those same abilities in order to make binding and, in many cases, very extreme decisions with regard to the liberties and rights of its citizens, all without having to bother with a pesky parliament. Unlike here in the effectively uni-party state of Victoria, many members of Dominic Perrottet's own Liberal government in New South Wales actually spoke out against this extension of fiat powers, when even the small government Conservatives dance to the tune of health bureaucrats. It really shows that there is no safe alternative as far as fundamental individual rights and democracy in Australia goes. We don't have an equivalent state of Florida over here where all such pandemic legislation has been repealed over the last year and a bit, and where the government actually apologised for locking down its citizens. We don't have a federal government that's at odds with the states. We have Liberal governments in Tasmania shutting borders to people in the rest of the country, I would argue in contravention of the spirit of the Constitution. And we have Labor governments in WA who don't even pretend to be interested in being part of the country of Australia anymore. All the while we have the dorky dad in office in Canberra who won't dare say a single word in opposition to any of them. He certainly won't say a word in opposition to popular state politicians like Mark McGowan and Daniel Andrews, lest it cost him a vote or two early next year. But perhaps even worse than evil and authoritarian, Scott Morrison's actions just demonstrate pure weakness. Back to the New South Wales government and its Victorianisation though. The Perrottet government has approved plans to extend the state's extraordinary COVID-19 emergency powers until March 2023, prompting a heated backlash from the coalition party room where MPs branded the decision an unacceptable overreach likely to be rejected by their communities. Now that's something that certainly didn't happen with the Labor Party in Victoria. The Australian can reveal that Health Minister Brad Hazzard took the proposal to Cabinet on Monday, where it was approved ahead of Tuesday's party room meeting. It's understood the proposal was based on a recommendation from New South Wales Chief Health Officer Dr. Kerry Chan. The state's COVID-19 emergency powers allow the Health Minister to make sweeping public health orders of the kind used all throughout the pandemic to control the movement of people and other measures including curfews, mask mandates and limits on mobility between local government areas. So these are extraordinary powers, not just your average density limits. An official familiar with the matter said the numerous MPs spoke against the proposal when it was floated by Mr. Hazzard with the backbench MPs, with several querying the need for powers to remain in place for another 17 months. And here's the kicker. According to an account provided to The Australian, Mr. Hazzard told the party room that keeping the emergency powers in place would eliminate the need to pass legislation in Parliament in the event that New South Wales experienced another significant outbreak of COVID-19. Wow. Now, as I've said all along, any government that wants to lock people up without any limits on its own authority should have to pass legislation to do exactly that. It should go through a parliament of our elected representatives. Just like forcing small businesses to track the movement of their customers using QR codes and other forms of check-in, they should have to go to the people and say, we, the government, want to be able to track your phones all the time for your own safety. Any politician that actually had the honesty to get up and say those words to their own electorate would probably find themselves out of a job pretty quickly, and damn straight. But so what else can we do in Australia? We certainly can't avoid making such disastrous laws like these in the first place. We'll just make it all happen through a permanent state of emergency, ensuring none of this garbage ever makes it into a permanent parliamentary record, and certainly, God forbid, any newspaper. Mr. Hazard cited recurring outbreaks and challenges in overseas jurisdictions, including those with high vaccination rates similar to New South Wales, as examples of why the emergency powers might be necessary in the future. The official who spoke to The Australian said keeping the powers in place until March 2023 would also prevent the need to legislate for them ahead of the 2023 election, as doing so may be perceived as unpopular with the community, they said. You don't say. Jesus H. Christ, you don't hold on to extreme powers in government just in case you might need them down the track, especially not when you call yourself a party of the centre-right, a limited government party. I mean, sure, things move fast in a pandemic, and back in the very early days of 2020, there might have been an argument for using these mechanisms to pass rules and regulations as opposed to running everything up the parliamentary flagpole. But that's not an excuse for anything more than efficiency improvements in the way we conduct parliamentary business. I mean, it certainly is not permission to dismantle the entire system of parliamentary checks and balances whenever a random emergency might require administrative haste. That's bullshit. And meanwhile, readers of Victoria's esteemed Age newspaper just can't for the life of them understand why anyone would want to place limits on government power or a politician's ability to do whatever the hell they want under the guise of an emergency. And obviously some of those haven't been paying particular attention to Victoria because they still claim that Daniel Andrews didn't lock down the state in a ring of steel because it was popular, when poll after poll shows that, probably because most of us in this state now rely on the state government for our income in one way or another, those restrictions were incredibly popular and remain so. Massive government restrictions are loved by the public servant class almost as much as they're hated by the small business class. And then there's the fluoro vests class who don't really give a shit until it affects their tea rooms on site. This is from Roy Morgan. Young people give the highest marks for Premier Andrews' handling of his job. Now this is very recent, November 16th. There you go, that's today. That's freaking today. The approval of Premier Daniel Andrews' handling of his job is heavily correlated to age. A large majority of young Victorians aged under 35, 72%, approve of Premier Andrews' handling of the job, compared to only 28% that disapprove. This strong approval declines progressively with age. Now, I don't know, but I have a feeling that might have something to do with the older you get, the more likely you are to be financially independent and work for yourself or have started up your own business. Most younger earners are wage earners. This strong approval declines progressively with age. Over 2/5, well that's wrong, that's 3/5. Over 3/5 of those aged 35 to 49 and 61% of those aged 50 to 64 approve of Andrews' handling of the job, while this drops to only 55% of people aged over 65. The approval rating for Premier Daniel Andrews amongst the genders matched the figures for the two-party preferred voting, with 65% of women approving of Andrews' handling of his job, compared to 55% of men. Now that is interesting. I'd like to know like to dig a little bit deeper on those statistics. A near unanimous 97% of ALP voters approve of Daniel Andrews' handling of the job, and a large majority of 84% of Green supporters also approve. In contrast, only 16% of LNP supporters approve of Andrews' handling of the job, and this drops to only 1.5% of supporters of the United Australia Party, which suggests that, as I've said all along, people on the left have no problems whatsoever taking control of the lives of others to a micromanaging degree, whereas people on the right are generally not comfortable with such moves, which is why good old Mr. Hazard here might find he has much more of a problem on his hands than Daniel Andrews, even though what he's after is effectively the same unlimited, unchecked, extra parliamentary power. We also know that Daniel Andrews is personally one of the most left-wing power brokers in the modern Labor Party, especially in Victoria, and not in a typical means of production unionised factory worker sense either. We know that COVID-19 is now a permanent feature of the epidemiological landscape of planet Earth, no matter what some ultra-bureaucrat thinks they can do to personally control the emergence of more infectious but typically less deadly variants. You combine all these factors and Daniel Andrews' approval, and there's a very real chance that Australia's parliamentary culture of state supremacy and separating the executive and the legislative power is about to come to an end. We're going to have increasingly presidential elections, more so than we've already have, because ultra-powerful premiers like Daniel Andrews will wield increasingly presidential powers, executive powers, without the need to run through Parliament, without the need to negotiate any specific bills through a bunch of crossbenchers, because those fiat powers have already been let through. Thank you, Fiona Patten, once again. And as long as they can keep the branch stackers and the more corrupt officials in their own party at bay, they're going to have a pretty easy time of it. We're going to become effectively just like America in terms of executive power, only without any of their constitutional safeguards against government overreach. That's what we lack. We don't have a national Bill of Rights. We don't even have an effective constitution in this country. So when politicians like Daniel Andrews and Mr. Hazard make the grab for executive power, it doesn't matter whether you're a Mr. Liberal or Mrs. Labor. Think of your worst enemy having that same power. None of them should have it unfettered. And when even the small government conservatives in the Liberal quote-unquote party, in our most populous state no less, are giving Victorian Labor a run for their money, we really are in serious shit in this country. Pretty sure Scott Morrison's not going to step in and help us out either. Anyways, look, I'll see you all in the brave new world this coming Saturday, 9 p.m. Eastern. Cheers.